My name is Carly Sini, and I am from the Centre for Adolescent Health, and I'm chairing the forum today. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I am on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and just welcome any Aboriginal people who might be joining us today. So we have a really great forum planned for you today, but I've got a couple of announcements first. We've got coming up at the Melbourne Children's Campus, probably the most important student event of the yearly calendar is the Student Symposium, where students have the opportunity to share their research that they've been working on. That will be running from the 14th to the 16th of September. So abstract submissions have now closed. However, we'd just like you to save the date so that you can plan to come and support your students or your cohort. And yeah, it was planned to be on campus. We're still waiting for confirmation, but it was already planned to also be hybrid. So some people might be presenting from on campus, but it's also going to be on Zoom as well. So people have that opportunity to stay home if they need to. The other thing that we have happening at the moment is that applications are now open for a postdoctoral fellowship with Melbourne Children's Global Health. Obviously, it's a really great team to be a part of. So check out the application criteria to see if this is the role for you. Great. Well, I'm really excited to be sharing this presentation with you today. So we have such an interesting forum planned and two awesome speakers to speak to us about adolescent injury. I'm going to go ahead and introduce both our speakers straight off, and then we'll let them both present and we'll have questions at the end. So you can pop questions into the Q&A box or into the chat, but we probably won't address them until the end. So both speakers today are also involved in our CRE on campus, the Driving Global Investment in Adolescent Health. So we have Dr. John Symons. John is an economist with experience in a number of applied economic areas, including road safety, green infrastructure and health. He has modelled investment cases for achieving road safety, health and education-related outcomes for several UN organisations. Dr. Symons has also worked extensively in environmental economics, including green infrastructure and the circular economy. So welcome, Dr. Symons. And Dr. Amy Peden is an NHMRC Emerging Leadership Research Fellow with the School of Population Health at the University of New South Wales. Dr. Peden is an injury researcher who focuses on drowning prevention and has special interest in regional communities, alcohol, and social determinants of health. Dr. Peden regularly appears in the media and is a co-founder of the UNSW Beach Safety Research Group. She also holds adjunct appointments with the Royal Life Saving Australia, James Cook University, the George Institute for Global Health, and Health and Psychology Innovations Lab at Griffith University. So very accomplished. Great. Well, I will let Amy get started. So Amy's going to go first and talk to us about the trends in adolescent health injury globally. And then John will take over and work on presenting the investment case. So I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Carly. All right.
No worries.
I will fire this up and just double check that everyone can see. Okay, that one. And then can I just confirm that you can see the screens and they've gone to see the slides and they've gone to full screen?
Yes, that looks perfect,
Okay.
Amy.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to present to you today. I'm going to kick off and talk about the research we did looking at global transport and unintentional injury, mortality and morbidity among adolescents. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Bitchigul land in the western suburbs of Sydney, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend those respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining and listening in today. So just by way of some background, injuries are a substantial yet neglected cause of mortality and morbidity, and this is across the lifespan. So the WHO estimates that 8% of all deaths globally are due to unintentional and intentional injury, which equates to about 4.4 million lives lost per year. But we know that fatal cases of injury-related deaths are just one part of the picture, and that tens of millions more people suffer non-fatal injuries every year. And these may be people that heal and go on to be physically okay, or it might be people that have permanent disability. And obviously we need to consider the physical and mental health impacts that a non-fatal injury can have on people. And this includes social, emotional and economic impacts as well. And it can be the individuals involved, but it often also spans families and communities and other loved ones. So it really is that ripple effect of one injury can affect a lot of people and can affect people in different ways. There's also a very significant health system burden from injury-related harms. So when we think about non-fatal injury, you might present to your GP, you might present to an emergency department, you might be admitted to hospital and need in-hospital care. You may also be, I guess, released from hospital and need ongoing rehabilitation. So there is a significant health system burden and even a broader community burden. When I think about drowning as an example, you know, that extends to our bystanders and lifesavers in the community as well. But the thing that is really, I guess, at the crux of all this is that these are all largely preventable incidents, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So before I go into the, I guess, adolescent focus that we took and the global perspective, I did just want to give a bit of an introduction to the issue of injury-related death in Australia specifically, but also across the life course. So this is AHW's data on underlying causes of death in Australia by age group 2018 to 2020. And what we're looking at here is for the green boxes, which are the injury-related causes, both unintentional and intentional. So we can see even in under ones, there's an injury-related cause in the top 5. The issues that I'll start to be talking about today include road traffic, here referred to as land transport, accidents, and we can see those coming in 1 to 14 years and then through to 44 years of age. And we won't be talking about intentional injury today, those causes such as suicide and assault, but you can see even in the 1 to 14 years age group in a country like Australia, suicide is still the 5th leading cause of death amongst our children, which is a pretty shocking statistic. So just, I guess, to give a picture of the impact that injury-related causes of death are having in the Australian population across the life course before we zoom back into adolescence. Go. So globally, zooming back in, I guess, to the younger age group, the WHO indicates that 3 of the top 5 causes of death amongst 5 to 29-year-olds are injury-related causes. We've got unintentional injuries comprising of road traffic injuries, and then we have the intentional mechanisms of homicide and suicide. For adolescents 10 to 24 years, which is how we define it at the CRE, injuries are the leading cause of death. However, there's been no prior research that's focused on this global burden of injury among adolescents, which to me was quite surprising. So that's why we conducted the study. We had seen regional focus on the issue before and some focus on particular mechanisms, so falls, drowning, poisoning, but nothing that focused on the broad spectrum of injury just for adolescents globally. So just to clarify, we have talked a little bit about unintentional and intentional injuries. We used the Global Burden of Disease Study dataset, which I'll speak to in a little while, but this is how they organise their cause hierarchy for mortality and morbidity data. So we zoom into the category C of injuries and are focusing on C.1 transport injuries and C.2 unintentional injuries. So within transport, the vast majority are road injuries, and within road you might have a bicycle injury, motor vehicle, pedestrian, motorbike, those kind of things. And then within unintentional injuries, you can see it's quite a broad category that includes mechanisms such as falls, drowning, fire, heat and hot substances, poisoning. We will talk soon about environmental heat and cold exposure and forces of nature as well, which are those disaster-related injuries. But yes, not focusing at the C3 level in this work. So what we did, we looked at injury-related harms, both deaths as numbers and rates per 100,000 population, and also disability-adjusted life years as numbers and rates. We looked at adolescents, 10 to 24-year-olds, but also broke that down into the 5-year bands within that to look at how risk differed by age group. So 10 to 14, 15 to 19, 20 to 24. We also looked at sex differences in injury risk. We looked at specific mechanisms, and then we looked at the results by socio-demographic index, which is a measure that the GBD study uses, and it's a summary measure of social and economic conditions which have been found to be strongly linked to health outcomes. And those they're broken into quintiles, so we go from low, low, middle, 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 high, and high SDI countries, and of course Australia is within the high SDI category. I was also quite interested in progress made in reducing injury since 1990, and we looked at percentage change in rates between 1990 and 2019 to look at that progress. So just a quick bit of insight into the data set we used, which was the Global Burden of Disease study. I'm sure a lot of you are probably very familiar with it, but in case you're not, it's a global or the most comprehensive data set globally. There's 286 causes of death, 369 diseases and injuries, 87 risk factors across 204 countries and territories. And that's a screenshot of the website there, but there's a range of resources on that website. Country profiles, you can receive training in how to use the GBD data. There's really great data visualization tools as well. And I think the thing to note is that GBD had predefined these time points. So when we looked at change over time and the results that I'll present shortly, we were kind of pre-designated to look at these periods. So the 20 years between 1990 and 2010, we took as one period, and also then looked at the most recent decade, 2010 to 2019, and looked at whether our the pace of change is speeding up, slowing down, that kind of thing. And it might seem old to some people that we're still talking about 2019, but it is the most current data available in the GBD study, although I believe 2020 data is due to be released imminently. But I think regardless of that, it is the last time point we have for this data before COVID had really wide-reaching impacts. We've already had a bit of an insight into the impacts of COVID-19 related lockdowns on injury risk. In some countries, road traffic injuries really dropped because people were at home and not on the road and not exposed to that injury risk. But surprisingly, at least for me, in Australia, our drownings went up in the first year of data after COVID, and increased the most in Victoria, which was our most lockdown state. So, you know, COVID has had wide-ranging impacts. Some from an injury point of view, some may have reduced the risk, and some it may have increased the risk for some mechanisms. So interesting to look at the forthcoming data to see the impact globally. But moving into the results, what we found in 2019 there was 369,000 deaths due to unintentional and transport-related injuries among adolescents, just over half transport-related, and 31.1 million disability-adjusted life years, and again, just slightly over half were transport-related. I think quite concerningly, we found that there was really very little improvement with unintentional and transport injuries as a proportion of all-cause mortality and morbidity for adolescents globally. So in 1990, unintentional and transport injuries combined accounted for 26% of deaths. By the time we get to 2019, that's only dropped by 1%. And same with DALIs, 17% of DALIs were transport and unintentional injury related in 1990, and that's just dropped by 3% to 14% in 2019. So while other causes of death and morbidity among adolescents are improving and getting a lot of attention, we see this continued, I guess, neglect for reducing injury amongst this age group. The other thing that I was really interested in was the pace of change, and particularly for high income countries, the pace of change and the rate with which we've been able to bring these injuries down has really slowed in the most recent decade. Transport injuries, you know, declining at 1.7% per year in the most recent decade, compared with 2.4% per year between 1990 and 2010, and almost no progress in unintentional injury-related DALIs, just 0.2% of a change in the most recent decade in high-income countries. So might speak to that low-hanging fruit, perhaps, and some initiatives that have made a really good impact on our rates, and we're left with those more persistent causes and risk factors that we need to address, but still, I guess, a really important reminder that we need to not take our foot off the pedal and really keep our focus to reduce these remaining lives lost and injuries caused by road transport and unintentional injury, particularly in high-income countries. So you can see there, there's a lot going on in this slide and the next one, but I've circled a couple of interesting things showing for transport injury and unintentional injuries for high SDI countries, that slowing pace of change in the most recent decade for both males and females combined. And I think slower pace of change, slower reduction in female injury rates compared to males in high SDI countries as well. And really for a lot of the SDI quintiles, pace of change amongst female injury has been slower than males. And just to flag on this slide and the next one, when we look at DALY rates, low SDI countries for the unintentional injury category have really been impacted by disasters and those forces of nature deaths. There were some big disaster-related events with big loss of life and loss of injury and injury, non-fatal injury, that have meant that we've seen a really marked reversal of those rates in the most recent decade. So just something to note there, and also important on the next slide as well. You can see the same thing across the bottom with those disaster-related DALYs in low SDI and that big change in the most recent decade. Again, highlighting in that high SDI area for unintentional injuries, really not much change in DALY rates, and concerningly, in the high SDI countries for females, those DALY rates for unintentional injuries have actually increased. So really not the kind of trend we'd be expecting to see, particularly in high income countries. So something to be mindful of as well. So some more results. We saw that injury rates increased as age increases. So risk was highest amongst the 20 to 24-year-old age band. And males, which, you know, working in drowning are particularly aware of this, but males are overrepresented in almost all injury mechanisms. And this is both for mortality and morbidity. But interestingly, we found that females had higher deaths and DALYs for injuries due to fire, heat, and hot substances and adverse effects of medical treatment. So I know there's been some talk in the media about maybe the way females are not treated equally in the medical system and maybe disregarded. So that's kind of something we need to have a bit of a look into. But I'll speak a little bit later about what might be going on with the fire, heat, and hot substances data, and something that we might need to consider. But those were kind of interesting findings when we typically see males overrepresented in injury. A subject close to my heart, because I really do focus a lot of my work on drowning prevention, is that within the unintentional injury category, drowning was the leading cause of death. And interestingly, it's a very lethal injury. As we can see, it's the leading cause of death, but then drops to the third leading cause of DALYs. Exposure to forces of nature, so those disaster-related injuries, are increasing since 1990, particularly in low SDI countries. And we've seen deaths due to environmental heat and cold exposure increasing in high-income countries in the most recent decade as well. So I'll talk a little bit later about the challenges with climate change, but there are some injuries there, drowning, exposure to forces of nature, and environmental heat and cold injury, that are very clearly linked to climate, and where, you know, action on climate change would have, I guess, environmental benefits, but also injury prevention benefits as well. So there's a lot going on this slide, but I guess we haven't really talked at a country level yet. So we thought we would just show this. The top panel horizontally is transport injuries, and the bottom panel is unintentional injuries. I think there's a few things to point out here. If your country's above the diagonal line, then you have reduced your injury fatality rate per 100,000 since 1990. And, you know, the further above the line you are, the better you've done. But I think it's interesting to note here the sex differences. So females on the left, as you look at it, males on the right, not a lot of change, but rates were quite low already amongst females, but there's been a lot of variability and change in rates amongst males. And interestingly, Iran really stands out as an outlier in terms of positive change in their injury rate, in their unintentional injury rate. I think we need to think about data quality there, but also, you know, if these are legitimate reductions in injury rates, then we need to look at what's going on in Iran, because it might be a real success story. And then quickly, just for how Australia compares, this is as a percentage reduction since 1990 in transport, DALYs and deaths, and unintentional DALYs and deaths, rates per 100,000. So we are above the high income average, which is great, except for our reductions in unintentional injury DALYs, and slightly below on deaths as well. So for transport, we are doing quite well, bettered only slightly by New Zealand, but outperforming countries like Canada, United Kingdom, and the United States. But as I said, our results, particularly in unintentional injury DALYs, is quite concerning and warrants a bit more attention. So I'm nearly done. I just wanted to kind of bring all this together in terms of challenges. I think what we've seen, and we might hear a bit about this in the next presentation as well, but what we've seen is that the funding and focus on interventions to prevent injury amongst adolescents, it really doesn't align to the burden. And we've seen that with the lack of change with injury and the proportion of the deaths and DALYs it's causing proportionate to other causes. There's also been a real neglect for the adolescent age group compared with particularly young children. And again, I speak to the drowning example. We've had a lot of success, a lot of funding, a lot of research, a lot of interventions focusing on reducing drowning among young children, and rightly so because they had the highest drowning risk. But I guess what we've seen now as those drowning rates have come down is that we've kind of neglected the next age group along. And while children are given some protection and reduced exposure to drowning risk and other injury risk while they're at school, there's a lot going on in the adolescent age group, and we really have seen a neglect for injury prevention interventions amongst this age group for drowning and other causes when we compare it to young children. Some work we're doing at the moment is looking at the effectiveness of interventions for preventing transport and unintentional injury amongst adolescents. And what we're seeing is that there's not a lot of evidence, and the evidence that we do have is from high-income countries. And so that's unlikely to translate to a low-income setting who have the highest burden of injury-related harm. So that is definitely a mismatch there between burden and investment and research into the issue. We've used the Global Burden of Disease Study, which is a very comprehensive data set, but it is modelled data. So we do need to consider the inputs that are going in, how recent that data was updated for a particular country on a particular injury cause, and how, I guess the quality of the inputs really do influence the model. And I think we do need to be careful about coding around intent. So whether some of the injuries that might be intentional have ended up being coded as unintentional. And I think there's something going on there with the female injury that we reported with fire, heat and hot substances. You know, there are some cultural issues with those kind of injuries in some countries. And I do wonder whether some of those intentional injuries have been coded into unintentional for a range of reasons. So that's something we need to consider. And if we think that, you know, data is poor in lower income countries, globally, we have much worse data on non-fatal injury compared to fatal injury. So it is something to be mindful of as well, that a lot of the non-fatal injury data will be modelled and is likely to be an underestimation. We've got some real challenges, I guess, as countries develop and move up the SDI quintiles, we do see lower risk. But we've got a lot of challenges with injury risk and urbanisation and rapid development, for example. So we need to consider when countries are developing and urbanising how we can make those environments safer and reduce injury risk, particularly road traffic injury. And climate change, I've already talked about some of the injury causes that seem to be increasing that are quite clearly linked to climate. So that is definitely one of the challenges. It's a challenge our planet is facing for a number of reasons, but also links to injury risk. But we can't finish on a downer. We need to think about the opportunities. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for investing in public and active transport, particularly in urban areas. That will result in a road transport injury reduction. But there's also a lot of other co-benefits. So environmental, physical health and mental health benefits by getting people into active transport and onto public transport as well. As I said, addressing climate change will reduce injury, particularly those injury mechanisms we know that are very clearly linked to those planetary drivers of climate change, like drowning, forces of nature, and hot and cold exposure. And also that work that we have spoken about today is leading into this work looking at what are the effective injury prevention interventions for adolescents, not just for road, as we'll hear about soon, but also for unintentional injury as well. And again, we'll hear a little bit later on, but just that importance of being able to take that data to decision makers to, I guess, ensure that investment is being put into the interventions that we know are going to be effective. There's also political will. I mean, we had this study come out around the time of the UN high-level meeting on road safety. And there is a lot of political will around action on the issue of road safety. And we're in a decade of action on road safety at the moment. So, you know, that is half the battle, I guess, to have at least perceived political will and political interest in the topic. I'd love to see that extended to other forms of injury, because road is really the injury that's most often recognised and actioned by governments. And we've got a number of other causes that are quite neglected, as we've seen. There are also a lot of links between injury prevention and the Sustainable Development Goals, which again could be another driver for action. So this figure here, it's pretty hard to summarise a whole nother study in this presentation, but I'd encourage you to have a look at this study we did in injury prevention, the journal Injury Prevention. We looked at, I guess, making the argument that beyond roads, the specific road safety target, there's a lot of links between the Sustainable Development Goals and injury prevention. And we make the case that really many of the SDG targets won't be achieved without action on injury prevention, and vice versa, action on injury prevention will assist with achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And in an Australian context, we are anxiously awaiting the release of the updated National Injury Prevention Strategy. We haven't had a strategy for a couple of decades now, I want to say, and it was completed under the last government and has been obviously handed over to the new government. And I believe that there are plans underway for that to be released shortly, but that will, I guess, give us all a framework to work towards what we need to action and the adolescent age groups represented, as well as some of the injury mechanisms that we've talked about. So just to finish up, I really want to thank the CRE, particularly George Patton and Kate Francis, for all her help with the data visualization and data wrangling. And I'm supported by the NHMRC Investigator Grant Scheme, so obviously need to acknowledge that. My email is there if you'd like to get in contact with me, and I'm pretty active on Twitter, so feel free to reach out and connect with me on Twitter. I do tweet about Formula One a little bit, so if you're not interested in Formula One, might want to give me a miss. And the study has been published in the Lancet Public Health. So if you want more detail, and there's a lot of detail that I couldn't fit into this presentation, but the paper is there if you'd like to read it. So I will hand back now and try and stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. That was awesome. And I had no idea that you were an F1 fan, so I'm definitely going to follow you on Twitter now. So yeah, that was, wow, such interesting presentation. And I have a lot of questions that I've written down, but I will follow my own rules and save them for the end, and let John have the chance to give his presentation first, just in case that answers any of my questions. And yeah, we're ready to go, John. You're welcome to start sharing your screen now. Okay. And yeah, just a reminder to everyone to pop, looks perfect. Pop your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we can get to them at the end. Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Oh, and sorry, I did forget to acknowledge Kim and Bruce, who are also online. Apologies, Kim and Bruce, and they're also John's colleagues who were working on the project as well and here to answer questions, the hard ones.
Yeah, hard or tricky ones. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Okay, so yeah, we with FIA Foundation and the CRE can extend this modelling we've done, looking at the investment case to reduce road traffic injuries amongst young people. And it was great for Amy to go first because she covered a lot of the sort of technical stuff that I had won't need to go into in detail, because she's already covered it. So we look at how certain interventions such as better road design, motorcycle helmets, vehicle safety standards would affect people in over 70 low, and we focused on low and middle income countries. So overall, road traffic injuries generate or cause about approximately 1.3 million deaths per annum. And it's, as Amy said, it's one of the leading causes of fatalities and serious injuries for 10 to 24-year-olds, which is the age cohort we're looking at. So just to give you a sort of trend that I should have included the 2019 one, but I didn't have a chance to update my graph, but essentially it's the same. You can see that there's the numbers of fatalities. By far the most are in those low income countries, the 70-odd countries that we looked at. So they are the primary reason for our focus on those areas, because they represent most of the fatalities and serious injuries. The rates are in the graph on the right. You can see that the rates for fatalities are much higher in those low and middle income countries, much lower in high income, and the 10 best practice countries have a significantly lower rate. So looking specifically at 10 to 24-year-olds in those low income countries, you can see they split of males and females. So as Amy also mentioned, around males are overrepresented, particularly around road traffic injuries or fatalities and serious injuries. And that gives you a split of what vehicle, we say, that they were involved in. So pedestrians, cyclists, motorcyclists, or car and truck or motor vehicles. So you can see in low-income countries, it's very high, nearly 160,000, lower in OECD or richer countries, and females represent a much smaller amount. In terms of the graph on the right, just look at the ratio of serious injuries to fatalities. The lower one is the cyclist. So the way we defined serious injuries, we said it's a type of injury that will prevent you from going to school or prevent you from permanently prevent you from working. So that's how we define it according to a few different studies. And in terms of that, the ratio, you're more likely the serious injury being a cyclist, sort of the inverted one there, than being killed in that particular mode of transport. And you can see how they change. It's very high, again, for low-income countries. So the approach that we took, we modelled certain interventions. We modelled speed compliance, alcohol level enforcement, safer infrastructure, which was a big one, motorcycle helmets, specifically for motorbike riders, seatbelts, obviously for motor vehicles, graduated licensing schemes, car safety rating or NCAP, new car assessment programs, and also public awareness campaigns. So obviously not all of them apply to every single mode of transport, but we applied them separately to each particular one. So according to our studies in literature, looking at the literature, we covered certain effectiveness of each intervention. I don't want to go through each in particular numbers, and also the cost relative to GDP of implementing those different interventions. And from those things, we were able to establish our benefit cost ratios, which we'll come to a little bit later. So just to give you an approach, again, we use the GBD data. As Amy said, it's the most comprehensive data source globally. So it's an amazing source of data that we can able to model these things. So we looked at the 3 5-year age cohorts, 10 to 14, 15 to 19, 20 to 24, males, females, and also modes, pedestrian, cyclist, motorcyclist, motor vehicle, and other. We modeled those all separately and also for fatalities and for serious injuries. So we got 60 baselines, separate baselines that we were able to calculate. And they did vary substantially from one to the other. So we needed that baseline in order to compare what we would forecast to happen, and then after this set of interventions, what how many lives saved or serious injuries averted. So to give you an example for Vietnam, this is specifically just for male 15 to 19-year-olds with serious injuries. You can see down the bottom the modes, and they give you the cumulative total of the higher line. The blue line being the total number of serious injuries, and after interventions is that darker line coming here. But we split them up and we modelled separately all of the different modes. So you can see that they have different trend lines. Some go up, some go down, and that's the thing we found, that for each country, some trend lines would increase, some would decrease, some would level, and it would change between age cohort, would change between mode, and also age, and also gender. So it's quite a complex modelling process to make sure we captured all those different trend lines, because they weren't all the same. Moving along, I'm just going to move my thing so I can see what I've got. So we took the sum of all the individual trend lines to give you annual fatalities and serious injuries after the interventions and compared them to our baseline forecasts, and then compared the cost of those. We used the cost of those interventions to reduce it for those countries. From that, we were able to estimate the economic and social benefits from the reductions. So that involved, just to give you a sort of the way the interventions work, they're independent of each other, so they have what's called a multiplicative effect. So it's a percentage of a percentage of a percentage, depending on how many interventions are being applied to a particular cohort or mode. or gender. So, for example, motorcycle riders, if you had helmet usage, alcohol enforcement, infrastructure improvements, speed compliance, graduated licensing schemes, all these things would multiply through to give you a certain percentage reduction in estimated fatalities or serious injuries. So the overall models can be just summarised in that image to the right. We looked at all those different interventions for the different modes, and that would produce the reduced fatalities and serious injuries. We also split it up into urban and rural. I won't go into that now, but as Amy also mentioned, the urbanisation issues are a significant factor as well. So overall, our results in terms of fatalities and serious injuries, it does vary quite a lot between males and females of how many we forecast, how many lives would be expected to be saved from fatalities and also serious injuries averted. You can see for males up to 2050, looking at about 1.9 million lives, which could be potentially saved, and 11.7 million serious injuries. You can see that how that varies substantially between the males from one age cohort to the next. So it really jumps from 10 to 14-year-olds to 15 to 9, and again up to 20 to 24s, and also the same increase but to much lesser extent for females, and the same kind of trends for serious injuries, but not as marked, for example, in the males, because they all had different trend lines, so they're not directly comparable. So the way we modelled it was from avoiding those, preventing those fatalities and avoiding those serious injuries. It's from the two main benefits was due to the increased employment that resulted from those lives saved, and also the productivity leading to high GDP and social benefits from a healthy life, over and above what we would forecast to be the case in a base case. So what we found was that we used those benefit cost ratios for the 70 odd countries we looked at. The benefit cost ratios at a 3% discount rate range between 4.6 and 66. So that what meant with an average of 16.8. So that means for every dollar spent, the interventions that generate benefits for $4.60, and that was Peru, up to $66, and that was Comoros. So massive BCR figures. We did do an optimization model to try and increase those BCR levels, where we said, okay, if we only have a certain percentage of GDP we can use, how many lives can we save, or serious injuries can we avert, or if we've got a certain target, how can we achieve that at minimum expenditure? And using this particular modelling approach, we actually found that our BCR results often more than doubled. Now, I don't have all that data in front, but I can certainly share that at a later date. We had, in our study, we did 3 case studies, and we looked at in greater detail because, as Amy mentioned, a lot of the data for the intervention effectiveness comes from high-income countries. So we tried to find some local data. We succeeded to a small extent in these 3 countries of Tanzania, Vietnam, and Colombia to try and use local figures and local interventions to see how effective they would be. So in Tanzania, it went from a base case expected 1,300 fatalities in 2020 to expected to go up to 2,100 by 2050. But using with the interventions and the local data, we estimated that could be reduced down to 880, and serious injuries from 15,000. It's expected to go over to 33,000, but we modeled we could reduce that to 13,900. But I'll show you in the next screen that Tanzania is quite tricky because its trending is quite high, which resulted in a relatively low BCR for fatalities of 2.6 or $2.60 benefit for every dollar, and the $38 for 38.3 for serious injuries and fatalities included together. So you can see the trend line for fatalities for 10 to 24-year-olds in Tanzania is continually increasing. So even after all the interventions are put in place, after a certain point, that will tend to go back up. because there are no more interventions, and because of the existing trend lines. But with serious injuries, it's even more marked, where the serious injuries seem to be increasing at a much greater rate than fatalities. So you can see what happened when that is modelled out to 2050 there. So the interventions being the dark line and the base case expected in the light blue line. So we did a similar thing with Vietnam, which had a very different mode split. There's a very, very high number of motorbikes in Vietnam. And so therefore motor helmet implementation is much greater effectiveness in that country. Again, we had a BCR of 3.7 for fatalities, and when included serious injuries and fatalities, 26.6. So you can see that Vietnam has actually done some really good work in the last 10 or 15 years, where their trend line is actually going down for fatalities. So we incorporated that into modelling those existing trends. But with serious injuries, they seem to be starting to come back up. So it resulted in a smaller decrease in fatalities, but a really large decrease in serious injuries in Vietnam. Finally, Colombia, again, we showed a significant decrease of BCRs, but down to 1.7 for fatalities, 4.9 for fatalities and serious injuries. But they're also having significant improvement in terms of their fatalities, and particularly serious injuries. So the benefit for serious injuries wasn't nearly as large because of their existing trends. But with fatalities, it did have more of an estimated benefit. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know we are limited in time. But so in summary, so as said, the road traffic injuries are leading cause of fatalities and serious injuries for 10 to 24-year-olds. We estimate 2050 we could save up to 1 million people's lives, and about 11.7 million serious injuries, with benefit cost ratios varying between 4.5 and 66. And that was it. I'll stop there. How do I stop sharing? Hold on.
Just down the bottom. Thank you so much, John. That was great. So I haven't had any questions in the chat yet, and I was going to send a message to everyone to say, put your messages in the chat, but I couldn't seem to figure out how to do that. I only send a message to us panelists. So anyway, pop any questions you have in the Q&A or the chat. The first thing that sprang to my mind was those BCRs seem to be really high compared to other things that I've read about for other economic analysis with, say, for example, other age groups. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I've been reading is mostly around non-communicable diseases, so it might be a little bit different anyway. But I was just wondering, like, from your experience, how does this return on investment compare for adolescents as opposed to other age groups? Are you seeing, like, we're often talking about how adolescents have such a investing in them is really important because it has the triple dividend, and I'm just wondering if that's coming through in your economic analyses as well.
Well, we only really looked at 10 to 24-year-olds, so we can't directly compare because we didn't generate that data. If Kim wants to explain in more detail, because he did a lot of the economic stuff. I don't know, Kim, you want to have a jump in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. I'm Kim Sweeney from Victoria University. If you save the life of a young person, adolescent person, basically they have the rest of their life in front of them and they go out to work and generate a whole lot of economic benefit. That's different from somebody whose life is saved at the age of, say, 60, because they don't live so long. So that's part of the reason why we get good results for adolescents. John and I have done this exercise a number of times now in different contexts, and basically getting the same sort of results. So we're agreeing with each other, but Also, if you look at, say, the World Bank, who's done work in this area too, they get similar sort of results. So this is not particularly surprising, and it's not particularly surprising in other areas as well. We've looked at, for instance, the benefits from vaccines, and in terms of NCDs, what we do find is that it's much lower when you're looking at things like depression and anxiety. But cardiovascular disease also, you get pretty good results. So I don't find any of this thing surprising.
Great. Okay, thank you. Sorry if my question was a little bit random. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Susan has said that, well, I'm not sure, but yeah, there's a question mark at the end. It is a question. Most of the interventions to reduce accidents and injuries lie outside the health sector, yet the health sector is an important sector that deals with many of the non-fatal consequences. What role can the health sector play in supporting intersectoral interventions? I think this question is just for everyone.
Do you want to answer, Amy? I've got my, we didn't exactly model that, but I have very strong opinions about that. So maybe I'll let Amy go first.
Oh, I was going to defer to you, John, because it's a really good question. I will just say quickly, there was a question in the chat about where to next. So we have, you know, I wouldn't discount the power of getting a paper into a journal like the Lancet or the Lancet family. So off the back of our study, we did reach out to various government departments, and you know, I think it was probably a function of, you know, UN meeting, we did some media, high impact journal, but we have conducted a briefing with health, and we will be conducting a briefing with infrastructure. So it is interesting talking with health, you know, as Susan said, they, you know, have to deal with the aftermath of this, but the levers to prevent injury are often outside of health. So I'll be interested to hear John's perspectives, but they even, you know, mentioned that they have to look at other levers, and in Australia, you've got also the complication of federal versus state, and a lot of these interventions are implemented at the state level. It's not really primary prevention, but I guess in a way maybe it is, but you know, preventing re-injury and speaking with people when they're in the ED or in the hospital or the health system about how to prevent a reoccurrence or prevent injury, I think is really important. But that might be a bit of a simplistic answer, so I might hand over to John.
I agree, and also local government actually, because safer infrastructure is a massive factor, particularly in low and middle income countries. So and we, our next phase of modelling, we hope to get include mode shifts, because we assume the same mode shift in all our modelling, in that we said, okay, it's the same percentage of people travel by motor vehicles, the same percentage by motorbike, etc. But so we intend to, we hope to be able to incorporate into our modelling where, okay, what happens if we shift to active transport, which is a key push, and how will that affect fatality rates, how will that affect health, morbidity, and those sorts of issues. With respect to the health, there's a misaligned costs and benefits. So to give a local example, much of the cost associated with improving, say, active transport to make it safer to cycle is borne by local government, some little bit of state government, certain department, but the benefits from that, where you have reduced fatalities, reduced serious injuries accrue to, you know, there's less health expenditure. So might be a little bit controversial. They may benefit from having less health expenditure in the health department, but the cost is associated with other departments. So those misaligned costs and benefits make it a little bit difficult to make sure that we all pushing in the same direction. And I think it's personally, I mean, we didn't explore this specifically, but it is the health sector has a very important role to play, because they have to deal with the outcomes of all these things, whereas you know, the causes or whatever, or the circumstances that come from the departmental regulations or infrastructure, that's a completely separate. And that's one thing we don't do in Australia. When we, for example, infrastructure again, when we assess or we model, okay, do we want to build a great new freeway, or do we want to increase the number of people riding their bikes? In Australia, we don't include what are the health impacts. Like in other countries, they do. So they go, so in Australia, it's primarily around, okay, reduce travel time. You'll save 90 seconds, so therefore it's worthwhile building. Or okay, what are the health benefits? What are the health implications of that going to be? I mean, how many will that increase fatalities? Will that increase, morbidity? Will increasing sedentary lifestyle? Those things are not included in our modelling for transport infrastructure, and they definitely should be, and more so.
Yeah, that's a really good point, John, and something that has also come up recently in the public consultations with Melbourne building another runway to the airport as well. They were talking about the health implications for that additional noise on the the surrounding areas.
Yeah,
of which I'm
no, I know where you come from.
Okay, that's awesome. So Susan's popped another question in for Amy. She said, Amy, you mentioned gender as a challenge with regards to the fire, heat, hot substances. Beyond women's role as a cooking as a risk, to what extent might these deaths be intentional, such as homicide, given what we know about shame that adolescents, girls' behaviour can be perceived to bring to families? Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sorry, I was listening so intently to John that I didn't even keep an eye on the chat. But yeah, it's a really important question, and I have to admit it's not my area of expertise, but I just get the sense that those findings, as you said, culturally, we might have girls more exposed to heat and hot substances because of cooking and domestic roles in the family. But, there is a lot of bride burning and, domestic violence that's related to fire and heat. And so I just wonder if there's a little bit more going on, and particularly, not wanting to, some cultures not investigating those cases fully or coding them, as simple as coding them as an unintentional rather than an intentional injury. So definitely not my area of expertise, but it was one of the findings that kind of caused me to pause and think a little bit about whether what we're seeing is actually what's going on. But yeah, there's some interesting things to unpack, I guess, in any global study you do, all the cultural differences and data quality and coding and that kind of thing that can really have an impact on the outputs.
But even the huge, burden in the high-income countries for the unintentional injury, I also thought, like specifically for females, I wondered how much of that was unreported intimate partner violence, being reported as an accidental injury. And the other thing that I thought of, which has been kind of topical for the past sort of couple of years, is the idea of the male body being the default body in terms of our, the design of houses and cars, and the crash test dummy example, and how women's bodies are perhaps it doesn't seem to make sense because males are the overrepresented groups. But it's interesting that in high income countries, where these things are reducing and perhaps there's investments being made, maybe the investments aren't taking into account how the female body is different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's that bias as well against females in a number of different areas. Or when you were listing out those options, I was like, basically everything, has been built around men. But I think there might be some, gender bias in those medical effects of medical treatment as well. Things, underdiagnosed in women and those kind of things. So again, not really my area of expertise, but I think there's definitely some things going on there. And I mean, I guess also you could say the greater burden in males means there are greater achievements that can be made and greater reductions that we can see. But I think it's a catch-22. You, like I was saying with children compared to adolescents, we rightly focus on where the high burden is, but then you take your eye off the other group to focus on one group and things start to creep up in another group. So we definitely, don't want to take away that focus on the really massively increased burden amongst men, but we can't not speak to injury prevention efforts amongst women as well.
Yes, Susan has also made the point in the chat that when she has previously spoken with South Asian leaders, it's been clear that it's asked about the cause, posing options of being accidental, and their responses were very clearly that it was homicide. Now, there's another question in the chat about how we can get a hold of your research, John, online. Your paper is out now, isn't it? Did you have a link that you could share in the chat to the group?
Not to hand. I can certainly, I'm sure it's on our website. Unfortunately, to great embarrassment, I don't have that.
No problem. If you share that with us, we can make sure it gets shared when we post the link. The presentation will also be available online.
So it's popped up. So it's on the FIA Foundation's.
Great, there you go. Molly's onto it. Fantastic. Sorry, I'm repeating everything in the chat because I wasn't sure if everyone can see it. Bruce has asked if you could expand on the BCRs, including morbidity, are much higher than for deaths. Could you expand on the reasons why?
It primarily just due to much greater numbers, because serious injuries essentially roughly tenfold to the number of changes from. It's different from one country to another, and it's also different from one age cohort to another. But as a rule of thumb, there are approximately 10 times as many serious injuries as fatalities. And the way we define serious injuries is an injury that means you are permanently injured and you would not be able to go back to work or go back to school. So therefore it has a lifelong impact. So because there's so many more of them, it has a much, if you can prevent them, and it's a percentage reduction of the total figure. So if you start at 10,000, you reduce it down to say 4,000, that's 6,000 you've saved, as opposed to reducing from 1,000 down to 400. So it's just simply a matter of there's so many more serious injuries.
Great, that makes sense.
And also we found that with increasing urbanisation as well, when we split the urbanisation and rural, because we find that the ratio differs between rural and urban areas. I didn't talk about that, but because it's essentially a slightly higher percentage of fatalities compared to serious injuries in rural settings, because usually the speeds are much higher. So therefore, if you're involved in a traffic accident, you're more likely to die, whereas the speeds are generally lower in urban settings. So therefore, you're more likely to be seriously injured as opposed to be killed. So that as that time goes along and most countries get increasingly urbanised, what we're finding, as our modelling shows, that you have a much greater rate of serious injuries and fatalities doesn't increase as much, or in some cases actually decreases because of that increasing urbanisation rate. And that's what we found in Tanzania, because that is a really rapidly urbanising population. So the serious injuries just kept going up and up, but fatalities actually we expected them to go down a bit.
No, that's great. So hopefully now everyone can see the links that have been shared. We've got John's FIA Foundation work. Yes, I think now everyone can see it. Hopefully, any problems you can just email Melbourne Children's Global Health and get the links that you need. Thank you, John, Amy, and also Kim and Bruce for being on the line. And yeah, really great chat. I'd love to continue talking more about this with you both, including to that exposure to forces of nature and the link to climate change. And we didn't really kind of get into that in much detail, but I'm also really interested in that. And the other thing that I just wanted to quickly ask John was, what's like the next investment case that you're going to be looking at?
Around road traffic or other areas?
Any either injuries or something broader in adolescent health?
Well, I've been working with Bruce a lot on child marriage, we believe, preventing child marriage.
Okay.
And that's part of a group of projects. We're doing child marriage. Other group, I think it's Johns Hopkins, who are doing the intimate partner violence, which you raised. So there's a suite of things with UNFPA we're looking at. Child marriage, it's a massive thing. 12 million girls a year are married under the age of 18 each year. So that's something we've been spending a lot of time on.
Mm.
And other investment cases, actually finishing off a big project in Syria, looking at their education system, because the investment case regarding that. So, but we hope to extend this road safety modelling, as I said, to sort of change the direction of modelling, not existing trends, and say, okay, if we are able to push them in a get a mode shift to active transport, what are the implications of that? That's what we would like to do next. We'll see how that goes.
That'd be fantastic, wouldn't it? Sorry, Kim, did you want to share something as well?
I just wanted to mention that we've been talking to Amy about doing a similar sort of work around drowning. So, but it's sort of early days on that. That would be useful, I think.
Absolutely, especially somewhere like Australia. We spend a lot of time in the water. All right, thank you everyone for a really interesting forum, and thanks for all our attendees for coming along. And yeah, it's been great. Thanks again. See ya.
Thanks very much.
Well,